So now we want to move on to talk about the influence that the corporate ownership of media in the United States has a huge impact on terms of a number of aspects about how the media does what it does, how it does its job. And we've already suggested in some way that corporate ownership, that profit motive that's introduced into the priorities that the media need to take into consideration when they think about what stories to publish, how they investigate, what the government officials are doing, how they ask us what we're doing, all of those things. We have to start with the point that we have corporate ownership of the media in the United States. Other countries don't have that. Other countries have it that the media are owned to some extent by the people. You have something like the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation in Canada. You have the British Broadcasting Corporation in Britain. You have TV5 and things like that. A lot of places, and in other democracies, you'll have advanced industrial democracies, that the media is owned not by corporations, but instead they're owned by we the people. They're funded by the government to some extent. It's not the same thing as when a dictator or an authoritarian regime takes over the media and influences how things are covered in that particular country. But instead, it is seen as an important role for the government to be involved in because the information that's being provided by the media are something that are so important. It's a public good, and it's something that the government needs to be involved in to some extent. But in the United States, we have a different way. We often have a different way in the United States, and some argue that that makes us distinctive in an awesome way, and other people argue it's distinctive in a terrible way. This one we're talking about not in terms of awful or great and things like that. Instead, it's to think about the influence that this has. And what we have in the United States is that the media, to a large extent, are controlled by corporations. And that introduces that they need to pay attention to a large extent the profits and whether or not the actions they're taking are going to increase their profits or decrease their profits. So it's something that they have to take into account when thinking about the things that they're going to do, the activities that they're going to do, how much is that going to cost. And so that's going to have an influence in terms of the media and how it influences us and what's covered and what's not covered. And more so than simply corporate ownership of the media, as the slide points out, that there are a very small number of corporations. These are, taking a look at Viacom, Disney, Clear Channel, News Corp, and AOL Time Warner. All that its name AOL Time Warner keeps changing the ownership. But the general idea is that there are only 5 or 6 major corporations that own most of the media outlets that we're talking about. And the other thing to look at, and I would never test you to know who owns which media outlet and things like that. That's not the important point of this slide. But the important part of the slide is, A, it is a very small number of corporations that own these media outlets. So Disney does own ABC News, and in doing so, it also has ESPN, and it has a whole range of different things. And so what we take a look at when we take a look at the corporate ownership is that there's a fairly small number of corporations that control the information that we get. And that leads to the observation that some people have argued is that we are the most informed, not the best informed. So in many ways, we have this illusion that we have all these different choices and all these different ways in which we can find out about the world around us, the number of podcasts that are available, the number of TV programs, the number of TV channels that are available in terms of delivering very specific sort of content to us. But at the end of the day, if it's controlled by a very small number of corporations, that seemingly of ideas isn't as diverse as we think. The other thing that you can see from this is the idea of not simply the most informed, but not the best informed, is also the idea that these corporations own a large number of, yes, news outlets, but they also have things that are there for entertainment. And so you see that these same corporations will own things like movie production firms. They will also be the ones that own publishing firms for books and magazines. They will also own cruises, or they'll own vacation spots. If you take a look at Disney, they even have their own islands. And so what we're talking about is that these are entertainment conglomerates that has as part of them news gathering and analysis of the news. And so what that leads to is that terrible term on the next book, this idea of infotainment, the idea that the media is meant to provide us with information that we need to know to be good democratic citizens, and that's absolutely an important thing to have. But at the same time, there is a demand that they provide that in an entertaining way. that it is something that we will actually, it's entertaining. And the combination of creating information that's provided in an entertaining way might change the way in which the information is actually given to us. Because at the end of the day, some of the information we might need to know to make good democratic decisions might be boring, might be complicated. We might have to do some hard work. And if it is instead presented in a way that makes everything entertaining, and if the only information we get are that information that's entertaining, then that might not be sufficient. We might actually have to do hard work. As we talked about earlier, no one ever argued that democracy was going to be easy. It is one that was going to take a lot of work. And in fact, Benjamin Franklin argued after the Constitutional Convention, it comes out, it's in Philadelphia's hometown, and this woman comes up to him and asks, Mr. Franklin, what have you designed for us at this Constitutional Convention? And he says, a republic, if you can keep it. And it is this argument that, a reminder that they didn't want a true democracy, but the other is that it's going to be a lot of work, and that we, the people, could make some decisions that could undermine this structure that was set up by the great minds of the framers of the U.S. Constitution. And you don't have to agree with him, but the idea of this is to say that maybe some of the information we need needs to be presented in a way that isn't as entertaining. But because corporations own the media outlets, the way in which they collect the information that has to be reported, and the way in which it's reported is all going to be done through the lens of trying to be entertaining at the same time. And so that leads to the phrase, it's easy to remember, and some argue it's not entirely true, but the idea of if it bleeds, it leads. It's an idea early on from the newspapers, and then also for TV news, in terms of the story that's going to be covered is most likely something that's sensational, that is going to grab people's attention. They're arguing the lurid effect of wanting to watch or see a gruesome car chase that ends in a crash, or a brutal double murder in Hollywood, or something like that. And those are the things that lead. And the idea of this is, from the textbook, this idea of agenda setting. We believe that those things that appear on the front page of the newspaper, or the first page when you do a search for terms, whatever is first, we believe is the most important. And that has an influence in terms of how we organize and think about what are the important stories and what are the important issues that are facing our country. And if in fact our newscasts start with something like a car crash or a murder or something like that, it's going to have an influence on us, as opposed to if you have a newscast that's going to start with a discussion of what the Republicans would put into place if in fact they get rid of Obamacare, or whatever sort of change that they seem to be talking about. For the day, it does seem to be that the sort of story that leads newspapers, that leads online news outlets, that lead TV newscasts, are those that are more sensationalistic, that are ones that are, if it bleeds, it leads. Those are the things, and that has an influence in terms of how we think and what sort of stories are covered and are not covered. The textbook does a nice job of pointing out that this idea of wanting to be entertaining leads to a certain type of newscasts, certain types of news stories that are privileged over others. And so what it tends to be is things along the lines of conflict tends to be more important. And some argue that that leads to this idea that cooperation, which may be important, as we talked about, compromise is an important idea of democracy, is undermined because there is something that is put into the sort of stories. It's all about the conflict. And some have argued a subset of that is the idea of trying to be fair and balanced, is the idea of creating conflict and making it seem like both sides have equal say in the matter. And so, for example, there are people, there are institutions who question the science behind climate change. But if you take a look at climate change and its dynamics and its impact, all whole part of the whole world system, science basically agrees that climate change is real, that human contribution to that is significant, and things like that. And even if there are institutions like those who are in the petroleum industry and fossil fuels and things like that, that have a vested interest in saying a different storyline, if the newscast feels that they need to make it more conflict-oriented, they will bring up the idea that climate change is something that people discuss and is actually being conflicted. And yet, that seems to create, most people generally think that, and most scientists definitely believe that climate change is real, and that debate is not about whether or not humans are creating this, and instead it should be, what do we do about that? And we need to do something very significant about it. And if the debate is elsewhere, it's sort of changing the nature of the debate. Another influence on the sort of stories that are covered are negativity and scandal. That those are two aspects that will lead a newscast as opposed to the important discussion of public policy or complex international news or something like that. An emphasis on celebrity. That is certainly something that we see here in LA news and things like that, but it is certainly something you see even online, obviously, is the idea that celebrity is important, or the emphasis of celebrity, even when we're talking about the actions taken by individuals. But it places an emphasis on individuals as opposed to institutions, when in fact, many of the decisions, political decisions that matter in our daily life, are things that are based on institutions, based on the underlying rules of the game, what the president can or can't do, what the legislature can and can't do. It's not really due to the personality. Personality matters, but it's not the only thing. It's not determinative. And all of these things are putting things like conflict, negativity, and scandal and celebrity first, crowds out the discussion of public policy, international news, analysis of what's going on. As your textbook points out, that a lot of the stories, they talk about this in terms of international news, but it's true for all news. It tends to be episodic, tends to be brought up as if there aren't underlying causes that have led to this thing to happen. Instead, it's just like, oh my gosh, there's been a terrorist attack here in this place. Isn't that crazy? And then there isn't really a sustained analysis of what that is or why that is not really as surprising as it might seem. It's certainly shocking and should be covered, but it's not as episodic as it seems. Instead, what we do need to understand these things are sustained analysis over time, but we don't get those things. And so what we get is novelty, drama, human interest is more important than sustained, sober investigation of complicated issues and dynamics. And that's really what we would need to make good democratic decisions in our political system.